My parents kicked me out for helping my elderly teacher. They regretted it when they saw who I became. In our fancy house in Coral Gables, my sister's trophies take up an entire wall. I sometimes joke that if we had to evacuate during a hurricane, my parents would grab her awards first, then her, and maybe, if they're remembered, they'd come back for their son. That's not even the kind of joke that makes people laugh. It's the uncomfortable kind where people give you that look of pity because they know it's probably true. Welcome to life as Alex Rodriguez. Not the baseball player, just the invisible brother Sofia Rodriguez. Social media darling with 2.5 million followers who hang on her every makeup tutorial and authentic lifestyle post. My dad sells multi-million-dollar properties to celebrities and athletes all over Miami. Mom runs her own PR agency that represents half the influential businesses in South Florida. And then there's Sofia, their golden child, their investment, their future. Our house is what most Americans dream about. Sprawling Mediterranean style with terracotta roofs, a pool that looks like it belongs in a resort, and a view of Biscayne Bay that tourists pay thousands to see for just a week. I should be grateful. That's what Mom always says when I complain. Do you know how many people would kill to live like this? The answer is many, probably, but they don't know what it costs to live in someone else's spotlight. Every Sunday, our backyard transforms into a content creation studio. Dad invites his high-profile clients for barbecues. Mom brings her PR connections. And Sofia gets a network and film with them. I'm usually asked to help set up the chairs or make sure the ice doesn't run out. Sometimes I film behind-the-scenes footage that Sofia uses for her day-in-my-life videos. I'm literally behind the scenes of my own family's life. Sofia's bedroom is twice the size of mine. Dad knocked down a wall to give her a creator space with professional lighting, sound dampening panels, and a backdrop system that costs more than what most people pay for a used car. Meanwhile, my film equipment consists of secondhand DSLR I bought with 3 years of saved allowance and birthday money. The contrast in how we're treated became crystal clear on our birthdays. When Sofia turned 16, Mom and Dad surprised her with a brand new Tesla. The whole thing was filmed, of course. The video got over 1 million views. 2 years later, when my 16th birthday came around, I got a book on cinematography and a gift card to Best Buy. Don't get me wrong, it was a good book. I still use it. But it tells you everything you need to know about where I stand in the family hierarchy. It's not that my parents are monsters. They're not. They're just strategists. They saw potential in Sofia early. Her natural charisma, her comfort in front of the camera, her ability to make people feel like they're her best friends even through a screen. They invested in that potential. With me, they just never saw anything worth betting on. The irony is that I love filmmaking more than Sofia loves being filmed. While she practices her camera angles and studies analytics, I study composition and storytelling. While she perfects her image, I try to capture truth. Last year, I made a short documentary about the elderly Cuban immigrants in Little Havana and how they're being pushed out by gentrification. It was raw, unpolished, and shot entirely on my old camera. It won first place at the Miami Youth Film Festival. When the announcement came, I was sitting alone in a sea of families. The other finalists had parents who cheered, who took pictures, who looked at their kids like they'd hung the moon. My parents were at a networking event with Sofia. I texted them that I won. Mom replied with a thumbs-up emoji 2 hours later. Dad never responded. When I got home with my trophy, a small glass film slate, Sofia was doing a live stream in the living room. I slipped past, careful not to get in the frame, and put my award on my desk. The next morning, it was gone. I found it a week later, shoved in the hall closet behind the winter coats we never use in Florida. That's when I stopped telling them about my projects altogether. School became my refuge. At Miami Art Academy, I wasn't Sofia Rodriguez's brother. I was just Alex, the guy who could turn footage of pigeons fighting over a hot dog into something that made you feel unexpected emotions. My film teacher, Mrs. Washington, was the first adult who looked at my work and saw potential. She'd been teaching for almost 40 years, and she didn't sugarcoat anything. This transition is jarring. Fix it. Or, your sound mixing is a mess, do it again. But she also said things like, you have an eye for the moments people miss, and you're telling stories that need to be told. She was the one who encouraged me to submit to the festival. She was the one who showed up. The crazy thing about living in my sister's shadow is that it gave me a perspective most people never get. I learned to watch instead of being watched. I learned to listen when everyone else was talking. I started to see patterns in how people behave when they think they're being observed versus when they think no one's looking. It made me a better filmmaker, even if it made family dinners awkward. That's what I was thinking about last month when I was filming one of Sophia's authentic morning routine videos. She had spent an hour doing her makeup to look like she wasn't wearing any, carefully arranging her casual breakfast of organic acai bowls that I had been sent to buy at 6 a.m., and making sure the sunlight hit her sleepy face at the perfect angle. As I held the camera, I had this moment of clarity. I was documenting a performance of authenticity that millions of people would believe was real. I mentioned this to Mrs. Washington during our after-school film club. She just nodded and said, "The most valuable skill in your generation isn't creating content. It's seeing through it." That's when I decided to start a secret project. I began documenting the reality behind Sophia's perfectly curated life. Not to expose her or anything mean like that. She's still my sister. But to explore this gap between image and reality that seems to define so much of American life now. The difference between the filtered beach photos tourists post from Miami versus the environmental problems killing our reefs. The contrast between my parents' family first speeches at community events versus the canceled family dinners when a networking opportunity comes up. I called it Life in the Shadows and only showed it to Mrs. Washington. Her feedback was simple. "Keep going. This is your voice." I didn't know then that in just a few weeks, an actual hurricane would turn all our lives upside down, that my little shadow project would become something much bigger, that being invisible would suddenly become my greatest strength. Because here's the thing about Florida sunshine. It's beautiful and warm and makes everything look picture perfect. But in Florida, we also know that sunshine is temporary. The storms always come eventually. And when they do, they don't care how many followers you have or how good you look in golden hour lighting. In Florida, the sun shines on everyone equally, but in our house, the spotlight has always been on Sophia. I've learned to find beauty in the shadows, in the places bright light doesn't reach. And sometimes, that's where the most interesting stories are waiting to be told. When meteorologists announce the approach of a Category 5 hurricane, my social feeds instantly fill with evacuation advice. Meanwhile, Sophia was busy creating a schedule for filming disaster content. That's when it hit me that our family was living in parallel realities. Hurricane Ethan wasn't messing around. The satellite images showed a monster storm taking up half the Gulf of Mexico, its eye staring directly at South Florida, like it had a personal vendetta against Miami. We'd had hurricane warnings before. They're basically a Florida rite of passage. But this one had the weather anchors using words like catastrophic and unprecedented. The governor declared a state of emergency for all of South Florida. Schools closed. Businesses boarded up. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Our neighborhood in Coral Gables transformed overnight. People hammered plywood over windows and packed cars to the brim. I watched our next-door neighbors, the Wilsons, who'd lived in their house for 30 years, tearfully loading family photo albums and their dog into their sedan. Mr. Wilson told my dad they were driving straight to Tennessee without stops. Inside our house, everyone had different priorities. Dad was on the phone with his insurance company and clients, making sure all his listings were properly secured. Mom packed essential documents in waterproof containers while maintaining her PR face, assuring clients via email that she'd be back in action immediately after the storm passes. Sophia set up her ring light to film a Hurricane Prep Essentials video, carefully arranging designer water bottles and expensive power banks that she'd never actually use. I packed my camera gear, hard drives, and the few mementos I couldn't stand to lose, including my film festival award that I'd rescued from the closet. The whole time, I kept thinking about the footage I could capture, not for likes or views, but to document a moment in history that might change our city forever. The preparation was just the beginning. The actual evacuation was like something out of a disaster movie. Every major highway leaving Miami was packed bumper to bumper. Gas stations had lines stretching for blocks. with some running dry before half the cars got through. Stores looked like they'd been raided. Empty shelves where water, bread, and batteries should have been. Dad managed to fill both cars with gas after waiting in line for nearly 3 hours. The plan was to take 2 vehicles, Mom and Sophia in the Range Rover, Dad and me in his Mercedes SUV. We'd caravan up to Orlando where Mom had used her connections to secure a suite at the Four Seasons. Even during a crisis, the Rodriguez family maintained certain standards. As we loaded up the cars, our phones kept blaring emergency alerts. The projected path of Ethan had shifted slightly, putting Miami directly in the crosshairs. The wind was already picking up, bending palm trees, and sending debris skittering across streets. That's when I got a text from Mrs. Washington. Not evacuating. Too much to lose. Be safe. My stomach dropped. I'd assumed she'd be leaving with family or through the senior evacuation program the city had set up. I called her immediately. Stepping away from the chaos of our driveway, Mrs. Washington explained that she was staying put. The paratransit service she'd scheduled had canceled due to overwhelming demand. Her niece, who lived in Tampa, couldn't make it through the traffic to pick her up, and most importantly, she couldn't bear to leave behind her life's work. Decades of photographic archives documenting American history, from the Civil Rights Movement to 9/11. It's just stuff, I told her, repeating what we Floridians always say about possessions during hurricane season. You need to get out. Her response changed everything. These aren't just things, Alex. They're stories. They're history. Some of these events, I was the only one there with a camera. If these archives are lost, it's like these moments never happened. I glanced back at our driveway. Sophia was filming a slow-motion walk to the car with her suitcases, probably for some dramatic evacuation montage. Mom was checking her makeup in the car mirror. Dad was still on the phone with clients. None of them would understand what I was about to do. I'm coming to get you, I told Mrs. Washington. Be ready in 30 minutes. I waited until everyone was distracted. Dad left his car keys on the kitchen counter while he went to help Mom with her bags. I grabbed the keys, took his backup credit card from the drawer, telling myself I'd pay him back someday, and slipped out the side door. I left a note saying I'd meet them in Orlando. It wasn't a lie exactly. I just didn't mention the detour I'd be taking. The normally 15-minute drive to Coconut Grove took almost an hour. Streets were already flooding in low-lying areas. Traffic lights were out at major intersections. The sky had that eerie yellowish-green tint that every Floridian recognizes as trouble. When I pulled up to Mrs. Washington's small bungalow, she was sitting on her porch swing surrounded by cardboard boxes, photo albums, and 3 cat carriers. She didn't look surprised to see me. I knew someone would come, she said simply. I just didn't expect it would be you. We worked fast, loading box after box into Dad's SUV. The categories written on them told the story of America itself. Summer 1965, Miami riots 1980, NYC blackout 1977, Ground Zero 2001. Some boxes were labeled with dates I didn't recognize, others with names of people I'd never heard of. Together, they represented a first-hand visual record history, captured by someone who, like me, was always watching from the sidelines. The rain started as we loaded the last cat carrier. The streets were emptying quickly as the outer bands of Ethan reached us. Wind whipped palm fronds across the road. Emergency vehicles raced by with sirens blaring. We need to go now, I told Mrs. Washington, helping her into the passenger seat. She nodded, clutching a small leather-bound photo album to her chest, the one thing she wouldn't put in the back with the rest. As we pulled away from her house, she watched it disappear in the side mirror. Neither of us knew if it would still be standing when we returned. The journey to Orlando was a nightmare. 95 looked like a parking lot. The rain became so heavy that windshield wipers couldn't keep up. Wind rocked the SUV like it was made of paper. All around us, families in packed cars looked stressed and exhausted. I kept my phone off, knowing my parents were probably furious by now. That was a problem for future Alex. Present Alex was focused on getting Mrs. Washington and her archives safely out of Miami. During a brief stretch of clear reception, Mrs. Washington showed me the photo album she'd been holding. Inside were black and white photographs of a young couple standing proudly in front of a small house, the same house we'd just left. My grandparents, she explained, the first in our family to own property in America. They worked as domestic help for 20 years to save enough money to buy that house in Coconut Grove. Back then, it was one of the few neighborhoods where black families could own property. She flipped through more pages. Children on the porch, family gatherings in the yard, celebrations and sorrows, all centered around that same small house. The final photo showed Mrs. Washington as a young woman, standing with a camera around her neck in front of the house. They lost everything coming to this country, she said quietly. But they gained a home, not just a building, the stories, the memories, the sense of belonging somewhere. As we inched forward on a crowded highway, rain pounding on the roof and wind threatening to push us off the road, I thought about what home really meant. The American dream started with the idea of owning a home. But sometimes the most valuable things aren't the walls that surround us, but the stories they contain. For Mrs. Washington, those were the photographs of 3 generations who first set foot on American soil. Proof that they existed, that they mattered, that they belonged. I thought the scariest thing would be watching hurricane winds tear roofs off buildings. But even Category 5 Ethan couldn't compare to the fury of my parents when I showed up at the Orlando Hotel with Mrs. Washington and her 3 cats. We arrived at the Four Seasons around 3 a.m. The massive lobby was packed with evacuees from all over South Florida, many still in pajamas or wearing whatever they grabbed as they fled. The desk clerk eyed us suspiciously, a teenage boy, an elderly woman, and 3 cat carriers. But Dad's premium credit card worked its magic. I got Mrs. Washington settled in a room 2 floors below my family's suite, made sure her cats had water, and helped her organize the most valuable photo boxes. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. I texted Mom that I'd arrived. 30 seconds later, the elevator doors opened, and there stood the entire Rodriguez family. Dad's face was a shade of red I'd never seen before. Mom looked like she was deciding between hugging me or strangling me. Sophia, naturally, was filming everything on her phone. What followed was less a conversation and more of a Category 5 verbal hurricane. Dad's voice carried across the lobby as he alternated between English and Spanish, a sure sign he was beyond furious. The gist was that I had stolen his car, taken his credit card, disappeared during a mandatory evacuation, and nearly given him a heart attack. Mom kept interrupting to remind me how many strings she'd pulled to get our suite, how she called every hotel in Orlando looking for me, and how I'd ruined Sophia's evacuation live stream with my selfish stunt. Sophia provided background commentary for her viewers. So this is my brother who literally stole our dad's Mercedes during a hurricane evacuation. The comments are going crazy right now. Yes, he's in big trouble. No, I can't believe it either. Hotel security eventually asked us to take our family discussion somewhere more private. The elevator ride to our suite was 17 floors of excruciating silence. Once inside, round 2 began. Dad demanded an explanation. I told him about Mrs. Washington being stranded with her irreplaceable photo archives, about how the paratransit service had canceled on her, about the historical significance of her work. Mom's response? You risked your life for old photographs? Do you have any idea what we went through? Dad's focus was elsewhere. My car has a dent in the rear quarter panel and a cracked tail light. Do you know how much that's going to cost? Sophia's contribution. My followers were so worried about you that they stopped watching my evacuation coverage. I lost engagement because of your little hero moment. It was like we were speaking different languages. They couldn't understand why I do something so reckless. For someone who wasn't family, for possessions that weren't ours, for history that wasn't directly profitable. Then came the credit card statement. Dad's phone pinged with the alerts. $2.78 for gas, $1,324 for the hotel room I'd booked for Mrs. Washington, $53 at a drive-thru where I'd bought us dinner. His face went from red to purple. You spent nearly $1,700 of my money without permission? On a stranger? I tried explaining that Mrs. Washington wasn't a stranger. She was my teacher, my mentor, the only person who'd ever believed in my filmmaking. The words bounce off him like rain on hurricane windows. What happened next still feels surreal. Dad paced the hotel suite, running his hands through his hair, muttering about disrespect and betrayal. Mom sat on the couch, shaking her head, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissue. Sophia had positioned herself by the window where the lighting was best, still recording everything. Then Dad stopped pacing. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not just anger, but something deeper. Disappointment, betrayal, maybe even a hint of fear that he no longer understood or controlled his son. "You chose a teacher and some old photographs over your family's safety and property," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "You stole from us. You lied to us. You damaged expensive property. You embarrassed us in front of everyone we know." Mom nodded along, adding, "Sophia's followers are already posting about this. Do you know what this does to our family image? To your father's business reputation? To Sophia's brand partnerships?" Then Dad delivered the knockout punch. "When we return to Miami, if our house is even still standing, you won't be coming home with us." The room went silent. Even Sophia lowered her phone. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I mean you're 18 in 3 months. Legally an adult. You've made it clear you don't respect this family's values or property. So you can stay with your teacher or find your own place or whatever you want to do. But you're not coming back to our house." Mom didn't contradict him. Sophia looked momentarily shocked before raising her phone again, but Dad waved her off. "Turn that thing off. This isn't content." Later that night, lying on the pull-out couch in the suite, as far from my family as possible in the confined space, I stared at the ceiling trying to process what had happened. I'd known there would be consequences, but permanent exile hadn't been on my radar. The strange thing? I didn't feel as devastated as I should have. Confused, yes. Anxious about the future, absolutely. But there was also an unexpected sensation of relief, like I'd finally broken free from a script that had been written for me without my input. We stayed in Orlando for 5 days while Hurricane Ethan tore through South Florida. The news showed palm trees snapped in half, streets turned into rivers, boats thrown onto highways, entire neighborhoods without power. Through it all, my family and I existed in a bizarre state of polite detachment. They spoke to me only when necessary. I spent most of my time checking on Mrs. Washington and helping her organize her archives in her hotel room. When the all-clear finally came to return to Miami, Dad made the arrangements coldly efficient. Mrs. Washington would ride with me in Dad's car, which he reminded me I would be paying to repair. Mom, Dad, and Sophia would take the Range Rover. We'd meet at our house to assess the damage. I'd collect my belongings, and that would be it. The drive back to Miami was surreal. The interstate was littered with debris. Military vehicles and relief trucks passed us heading south. Gas stations had lines that stretched for blocks, with armed guards preventing fights over fuel. Palm trees that had stood for decades were now horizontal. Billboard advertisements for beachfront condos flapped in tatters over scenes of actual destruction. Mrs. Washington sat quietly beside me for most of the journey, occasionally pointing out particularly striking images of destruction or recovery. "That would make a powerful shot," she'd say, or "Notice the contrast between that luxury hotel and the tent city forming next door." Even in crisis, or perhaps especially in crisis, she was teaching me to see. When we finally reached Coral Gables, our neighborhood had fared better than most. Fallen trees and debris everywhere. But most houses were intact, including ours. The Rodriguez luck had held. Meanwhile, the news reported that parts of Miami Beach and downtown were still underwater. Inside our house, the power was out, but the structure was sound. A few broken windows had let in some water, but nothing catastrophic. Dad immediately started making calls to contractors. Mom began inventorying damaged items for insurance. Sophia set up her ring light, connected to a portable battery pack, to film her returning home content. I went to my room and started packing. Clothes, equipment, hard drives, books. The accumulation of 18 years condensed into what could fit in a few bags and boxes. It felt mechanical, surreal, like I was watching myself go through the motions from somewhere else. While gathering my stuff in the hall closet, I found something unexpected behind a stack of beach towels, a shoebox containing my film festival trophies and certificates. Not just a recent one, but all of them going back to middle school. Awards I'd assumed were thrown away or lost. Someone, Mom, probably had kept them all this time, hidden away like shameful secrets. I sat on the floor of the closet, surrounded by evidence that my accomplishments had been acknowledged, then deliberately tucked out of sight. Not displayed like Sophia's endless wall of recognition, but not discarded either. Just contained, controlled. Like me, I sat there for a while, processing what these hidden awards meant about my place in this family. Eventually, I packed them along with everything else and finished loading my bags into Dad's car, which he made clear was only on loan until I found other transportation. I didn't know where I would go. My few friends' homes were likely damaged, and I couldn't impose on them during a disaster recovery. After saying a stiff goodbye to my parents, with Sophia filming the emotional family moment from the doorway, I drove away. My first stop was Mrs. Washington's house to check how it had fared in the storm. Pulling up to her bungalow, I was relieved to see it standing. The yard was littered with debris. A window was broken, and part of the roof looked damaged, but the structure was intact. Mrs. Washington was on her porch, already directing a neighborhood teenager who was helping clear branches. When she saw me with my car full of belongings, she didn't seem surprised. I explained everything that had happened, about being kicked out and having nowhere to go. She listened without interrupting, then simply said, "The guest room needs airing out, but it's yours for as long as you need it." Not a question, a statement, a solution when I needed one most. Before I could even thank her, she was already pointing to where I should park and asking if I could help bring her cats inside from the car. The 3 elderly felines had endured quite the adventure over the past week and were ready to reclaim their territory. As I carried the first cat carrier toward her house, I looked back in the direction of my childhood home. From here, I could almost see my neighborhood, where Mom was likely directing contractors, Dad was on his phone with insurance, and Sophia was shooting tearful monologues about community resilience for her followers. They were already adapting their narrative, one that would likely minimize or omit my absence. In the Rodriguez family story, I had always been a supporting character at best. Now I was being written out entirely. Walking up the steps to Mrs. Washington's porch, carrying a disgruntled cat, while surrounded by hurricane debris, a thought struck me with unexpected clarity. In Florida, every house has hurricane windows, but none has protection from the emotional storms inside. Behind the facade of the perfect American family often lurks an imbalance that only waits for strong winds to reveal itself. Ethan had exposed more than just physical vulnerabilities. It had torn away the carefully constructed image of what families are supposed to be, revealing the reality underneath. And sometimes that revelation is more terrifying than any storm. Never underestimate a 76-year-old woman from Jamaica who fought through segregation to become a photojournalist. Mrs. Washington would look at my work and tell me, "You're shooting what the eyes see, not what the heart feels. That's your problem." Living in Mrs. Washington's guest room was like getting a master class in visual storytelling. My first morning there, I woke up to find her sorting through boxes of photos in the living room, carefully checking each one for water damage. The 3 cats supervised from various perches, occasionally pawing at the edges of particularly interesting images. I offered to help, and that's when the education began. Each photo came with a story, not just about the technical aspects, though she had plenty to say about those too, but about the human context behind the images. "Look at this," she said, holding up a black and white photograph of protesters facing police officers in riot gear. Birmingham, 1963. Those officers were just regular men with families. Those protesters were just ordinary people wanting basic rights. But look at their eyes. The humanity is there, even in the conflict. As we worked through the archives, I learned that Mrs. Washington wasn't just some retired school teacher who liked photography. She was one of the first female African-American photojournalists to document the civil rights movement from the inside. Her work had appeared in major newspapers and magazines under various pseudonyms because As she explained, nobody wanted to credit a black woman from Jamaica back then. Her apartment walls, now that I was really looking, were a museum of American history. Photos of Martin Luther King Jr. speaking to crowds. Malcolm X in quiet conversation with supporters. The aftermath of riots in Miami's Liberty City in 1980. The AIDS crisis protests in the late 80s. 9/11 from street level in Lower Manhattan. How have I never heard of you? I asked, realizing I was living with someone who had witnessed and documented some of the most significant moments in modern American history. She just laughed. History remembers the names it chooses to remember. Alex. I wasn't trying to be remembered. I was trying to make sure what I saw wasn't forgotten. The Miami that emerged after Hurricane Ethan was a city divided, not just by damage, but by recovery resources. Coral Gables and other wealthy areas were already rebuilding, while parts of Liberty City, Little Haiti, and Hialeah remained without power or proper aid. The inequality was stark and visible in a way it usually wasn't. One week after moving in with Mrs. Washington, she handed me one of her old Nikon film cameras. Digital is fine for practice, but film makes you think before you shoot, she said. Now go document what's happening. Not just the broken buildings, the broken system. I spent days wandering through different neighborhoods, capturing the contrast in recovery efforts. A luxury condo building in Brickell already had construction crews working around the clock, while 3 miles away, families were still living in tents because their apartment building had been condemned. Mrs. Washington taught me to look for the stories within the chaos. Don't just shoot the destruction, she advised. Find the moments of humanity. The neighbors sharing generators. The volunteers distributing water. The kids turning debris into playground equipment, because resilience is in our DNA. Her teaching methods were unconventional. She looked through my day's photos, select one, and asked me to tell the story behind it. If I couldn't, or if the story was shallow, she'd make me go back the next day and talk to the people I was photographing. Photography without empathy is just surveillance, she told me. My greatest lesson came when she caught me photographing a mother and her children outside a FEMA relief center. I was shooting from across the street with a telephoto lens. That evening, Mrs. Washington looked through my images and paused on that one. Did you ask her story? No, I didn't want to intrude. She put the camera down and fixed me with a stare that could cut through steel. You're already intruding by taking her picture. The difference is whether you're treating her as a subject or a human being. The next day, I returned to the same relief center. The same woman was there, still waiting in line. This time, I approached her, introduced myself, and asked if I could hear her story while documenting the FEMA response. Maria had lost everything in the hurricane. She and her 3 kids were sleeping in their car because the shelter was full. She'd been waiting for assistance for 4 days and kept getting sent to different locations due to paperwork issues. I stayed with her the entire day, photographing the process, helping with forms, my Spanish came in handy, and eventually witnessing her receive a housing voucher. The relief on her face when she realized her kids would sleep in beds at night. That was the moment Mrs. Washington had been trying to get me to see. That night, I edited the photos and combined them with others I'd taken across Miami. I wrote a detailed Instagram post about the disparities in hurricane response and the real human cost of bureaucratic inefficiency, featuring Maria's story with her permission. I woke up the next morning to find my follower count had jumped from a few hundred to several thousand. The post had been shared by community activists, then picked up by local news outlets looking for stories about recovery efforts. Suddenly, people wanted to see more. I started a series called After Ethan, The Real Recovery, posting daily photo essays about different communities across Miami. Each one centered on specific people and their experiences, always with their stories included alongside the images. Mrs. Washington reviewed every post before I published it. Her critiques were harsh but constructive. Good composition, but where's the hope? Or strong technical work, but you're keeping too much distance from your subject. The series gained traction, especially after local news blog featured it in an article about grassroots hurricane coverage. People appreciated seeing the unfiltered reality of recovery, both the struggles and the triumphs. instead of the sanitized versions on mainstream media or the dramatized content that influencers like my sister were producing. Sophia, meanwhile, had pivoted to recovery fashion and hurricane-friendly beauty routines, along with occasional charity drives that seemed more focused on photo ops than actual assistance. I tried not to dwell on the contrast, but it was hard to ignore. 3 weeks after starting the series, I received an email from the photo editor at the Miami Herald. They wanted to talk about featuring some of my images in their ongoing hurricane coverage. The subject line was impressive documentary work. I stared at my phone, not quite believing what I was reading. Then I looked around at Mrs. Washington's living room, where we'd spread out prints from my latest shoot. She was sipping tea, red pen in hand, ready to critique my newest images. Someone from the Herald wanted to talk about my photos. I told her, still in shock. She didn't even look up. Of course they do. You finally started shooting with your heart instead of just your eyes. That night, as I prepared the images to send to the Herald, I realized something profound. When you think you've lost everything, you suddenly see the world without the filters others have placed over it. Sometimes that's the most valuable gift you can receive. Mrs. Washington had lost her home multiple times throughout her life, to discrimination, to previous hurricanes, to economic hardship, but she never lost her ability to see and capture truth. Now she was teaching me to do the same. For the first time since being kicked out of my family's house, I didn't feel like I'd lost everything. I'd actually gained a new way of seeing. When your inbox contains emails from Netflix, HBO, and A24 all in one day, you start to realize that getting kicked out of your home might have been the best thing that ever happened to you. But let me back up a bit. Success didn't happen overnight, even if it sometimes feels that way looking back. After the Miami Herald featured my photos, things started snowballing. Local TV stations wanted interviews about my hurricane coverage. Online publications picked up the story of the teenager documenting Miami's unequal recovery. My Instagram following jumped from thousands to hundreds of thousands in weeks. The real turning point came 3 months after Hurricane Ethan. I've been compiling my photos and videos into a more structured documentary project called After the Storm. The title wasn't particularly original, but the content was raw and real in a way that resonated with people far beyond Miami. I'd learned from Mrs. Washington to follow stories long after the news vans left. While national coverage had moved on to the next disaster, I kept documenting the ongoing struggles in forgotten neighborhoods and the resilience of communities rebuilding without headlines. My approach was simple: show the contrast between neighborhoods that had recovered in weeks and those still waiting for basic services months later. But instead of making a political statement, I focused on the human stories. The single mom running a makeshift daycare from her damaged apartment so neighbors could go to work. The elderly Cuban couple who turned their front yard into a community kitchen. The teenagers who organized debris removal teams when city services were overwhelmed. Mrs. Washington reviewed every edit, pushing me to dig deeper and ask harder questions. Good documentaries don't just show what happened, she'd say. They show why it matters. The finished film, a 45-minute documentary shot on a mixture of digital and Mrs. Washington's old film cameras, debuted on YouTube without much fanfare. I shared it on my Instagram, sent it to a few local journalists who'd cover my photography, and went to bed. I woke up to find it had over 100,000 views. By that evening, it had passed 1 million. The comments section was flooded with people sharing their own hurricane stories from across the country. News sites were embedding it. Film critics were tweeting about it. Someone from Vimeo called to feature it as a staff pick. Then came the email that changed everything. An invitation to submit After the Storm to the Sundance Film Festival's documentary shorts program. I nearly fell off Mrs. Washington's couch when I read it. Apparently, a selection committee member had seen my film and thought it deserved consideration, even though the submission deadline had technically passed. Mrs. Washington's reaction was classic. "Well, what are you waiting for? Send it in, then get back to work. Success is just the beginning of harder work." She was right, of course. The next few months were a whirlwind of revisions, paperwork, and anxiety. I spent days refining the edit, improving the sound mix at a local studio that offered their services for free, and scrambling to understand film festival requirements. When the acceptance email came, Mrs. Washington and I celebrated with her special Jamaican rum cake and tea. Her only comment, "Now the real test begins. Remember, no matter who tries to change your voice, it's your story to tell." Sundance was surreal. Park City in January was as far from Miami as you could get, both in climate and culture. I'd never seen so much snow or so many people in puffer jackets talking about narrative arcs and distribution strategies. Mrs. Washington came with me, of course. The festival organizers had been thrilled to learn about her photography background and arranged for a small exhibition of her civil rights movement photos alongside my film screening. I wish I could say I was cool and collected during the festival, but the truth is I was a nervous wreck. I'd never spoken in front of film industry people before. I'd never done a Q&A session. I'd certainly never had to explain my artistic choices to a room full of critics and filmmakers. But something strange happened during the first screening. As I watched my film with an audience for the first time, hearing their reactions, their gasps, their murmurs of recognition, I realized I created something that truly connected. The nervous energy transformed into a weird, calm confidence. When After the Storm won the Short Film Jury Award for Documentary, I was too shocked to properly thank everyone. My acceptance speech was probably the shortest in Sundance history. Thanks to everyone who let me tell their stories, and to Mrs. Washington for teaching me how to see them. The real frenzy began after Sundance. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with emails and calls from industry people. Agents wanted to represent me. Production companies wanted to meet. A24, the indie studio behind some of my favorite films, wanted to discuss expanding After the Storm into a feature-length documentary. I signed with a small agency that specialized in documentary filmmakers, partly because the agent reminded me of Mrs. Washington. No nonsense, straight talking, and primarily concerned with protecting my creative voice. The A24 meeting happened over Zoom, with me sitting at Mrs. Washington's kitchen table while her cats occasionally wandered into frame. The executives didn't seem to mind. In fact, one of them called it authentically on brand. The deal they offered was beyond anything I could have imagined. Funding to expand After the Storm into a feature documentary with a proper budget, crew, and distribution plan. They wanted to maintain the raw style and approach, but give me the resources to tell the story on a bigger canvas. 6 months later, I was directing a small crew through various hurricane-affected communities across Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana, documenting the broader pattern of unequal disaster recovery across the South. Mrs. Washington came along as consulting producer, teaching my camera operators her techniques for establishing trust with subjects. The feature version of After the Storm premiered at the next year's Sundance to critical acclaim. Netflix acquired the streaming rights for a figure that made me check the contract 3 times to be sure I wasn't misreading the zeros. Suddenly, at 19, I had more money in my bank account than I'd ever imagined possible. The most surreal moment came when my phone buzzed with an email from HBO. They were developing a drama series about climate disasters and community response, inspired partly by my documentary. They wanted me to direct several episodes. That same day, A24 reached out about a potential narrative feature based on themes from After the Storm, with a budget of $20 million. The subject line was simply, "Ready to tell stories on an even bigger canvas?" My first call was to Mrs. Washington. "I need you on both projects," I told her. "Executive producer, consultant, whatever title works. I need your eyes and your wisdom." Her response was typically understated. "I suppose I could clear my schedule. The cats will have to manage without me for a while." The Netflix money meant I could buy Mrs. Washington a new roof, update her home's hurricane protection, and set up a foundation to preserve her photographic archives. The HBO and A24 contracts meant I could ensure she'd never worry about finances again. When my first major paycheck cleared, I bought myself exactly one luxury, a car to replace the one I'd returned to my father months earlier. Nothing flashy, just reliable transportation. That was truly mine. Looking back at how far I'd come in just over a year, from being kicked out with nowhere to go to having Hollywood studios competing for my next project, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. In the 21st century, Success isn't just measured by your bank account, but by whether you can make millions of strangers feel emotions through a screen. Turns out I was much better at that than my parents ever thought. When my banking manager asked if I wanted to discuss investment strategies for my several million, I couldn't help but laugh. 6 months earlier, I didn't even have my own bed. Life moves at warp speed in the entertainment industry. One day you're a kid with a camera documenting hurricane damage. The next you're sitting across from executives discussing multi-million-dollar budgets like it's totally normal. The surreal part isn't just the money. It's how quickly everyone treats you differently when success comes knocking. My first major decision with my newfound wealth was surprisingly simple: finding a permanent home. After living in Mrs. Washington's guest room for over a year, I needed my own space, especially with my work schedule becoming increasingly hectic. But I wasn't interested in the massive mansions in Coral Gables where I grew up. Instead, I found a modest but beautiful house in Coconut Grove, just a few blocks from Mrs. Washington. The real estate agent seemed disappointed when I passed on the waterfront properties she kept showing me. "You can afford so much more," she insisted, pulling up listings for places with infinity pools and private docks. I ended up buying a mid-century modern home with good bones, but hurricane damage that had scared off other buyers. It needed work, but it had character and history, two things I'd learned to value. Plus, fixing something broken had become a metaphor for my entire career. The renovation became my side project between film commitments. I hired local contractors who'd been featured in my documentary, people still rebuilding their own communities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Many were immigrant workers who'd helped build my parents' fancy house years ago, and now they were helping me create my own home on my own terms. My second major decision was establishing Hurricane Films. My production company focused on stories about resilience and systemic inequalities. The name was obvious. Hurricanes had destroyed my old life and created my new one. The company logo featured a camera lens inside a hurricane symbol, designed by a graphic artist I'd met while documenting recovery efforts. Setting up the company was a crash course in business education. I hired people who knew what I didn't: experienced producers, entertainment lawyers, development executives. But I made sure our mission statement kept us grounded, telling stories that remain after news cameras leave. Our first slate of projects included documentaries about climate refugees, a series exploring different communities' disaster response systems, and the biggest swing, a narrative feature inspired by stories I collected during After the Storm. For the feature film, 824 connected me with veteran screenwriter who helped shape my documentary footage and interviews into a compelling script. The story centered on a community coming together after a devastating hurricane, with subtle commentary on race, class, and who gets left behind when the rebuilding begins. Casting the film brought another surreal moment. Actors whose work I'd admired for years were suddenly reading our script and asking to meet. We ended up with an ensemble cast that included 2 Oscar nominees and several up-and-coming performers who connected personally with the material. Mrs. Washington remained my secret weapon throughout the process. I officially hired her as the film's historical consultant, but unofficially, she was my reality check. Whenever I started getting swept up in Hollywood glitz or studio politics, she'd remind me why we were telling these stories in the first place. The industry award season brought a full-circle moment I never anticipated. Hurricane Films' documentary series received multiple nominations, and our narrative feature was generating early buzz. Suddenly, I found myself at the same galas and ceremonies that Sophia had always dreamed about, wearing designer clothes I would have scoffed at 2 years earlier. The ultimate irony? My photo appeared in the same glossy magazines that used to feature Sophia's influencer content. One magazine even ran a profile titled The Other Rodriguez, Hollywood's new authentic voice, without a hint of awareness about how that headline would land in my family's household. Sophia's star had faded somewhat after the hurricane. The appetite for carefully curated lifestyle content had diminished in favor of more authentic voices. She'd pivoted to advocacy work, though her approach still seemed more focused on aesthetics than action. We occasionally exchanged polite but distant text messages on birthdays and holidays. My parents were a different story. As my profile rose in the entertainment industry, they suddenly found reasons to reconnect. First came congratulatory texts when After the Storm won at Sundance. Then a small gif when Netflix acquired the documentary, when my name started appearing in industry publications. Dad called to say he'd always believed in my creative potential. The conversation was awkward and brief. He mentioned some of his real estate clients were in the film business and offered to make introductions. I thanked him politely, but explained I already had a team. Before hanging up, he mentioned almost casually that they still had some of my things in storage if I wanted them back. Mom's approach was more direct. She showed up at a public screening of my documentary in Miami, waiting in line for Q&A like any other attendee. When she reached the microphone, the audience had no idea that the well-dressed woman asking about my inspirations was my mother. I answered honestly. I was inspired by people who saw value in preserving stories that others deemed disposable. 2 weeks later, she sent an email suggesting lunch. We met at a neutral restaurant halfway between my new home and my childhood one. The conversation was strained but civil. She asked about my projects, mentioned she'd seen my interview on a morning show, and then finally got to her real point. They were proud of me and wanted to be part of my life again. I listened, nodded, and then asked a question that had been burning inside me. Is it me you want back, or the successful director I become? She didn't have an immediate answer, which was itself an answer. We left it with a tentative agreement to stay in touch. No promises, no dramatic reconciliation, just an acknowledgement that relationships, like hurricane-damaged structures, need careful assessment before rebuilding can begin. The most meaningful relationship I rebuilt wasn't with my biological family, but with Miami itself. Hurricane Films established a fellowship program for young filmmakers from underrepresented communities in South Florida. We renovated an old warehouse in Little Haiti into a community media center where kids could learn production skills. Every year, we funded documentary projects about local issues that mainstream media overlooked. Mrs. Washington served on the fellowship selection committee, bringing her sharp eye and no-nonsense feedback to a new generation. Watching her mentor young photographers reminded me of how far I'd come from being that invisible kid with a camera, desperate for someone to notice my perspective. On the 3rd anniversary of Hurricane Ethan, we held a special screening of After the Storm, followed by a showcase of films made by our fellowship recipients. The event was held in a community center that had once been a hurricane shelter. As I looked around at the packed room, storm survivors, film industry people, community organizers, and a new crop of young storytellers, I felt a sense of completion. The American dream is often told as a story about a house with a white picket fence. But for me, it became a story about building my own path without fences or limitations. Sometimes you need to lose a home you were given in order to build your true place in the world. That night, standing in a community rebuilt after devastation, surrounded by stories that might never have been told, I realized something profound. Hurricanes don't just destroy. In their aftermath, they create space for something new to emerge from the wreckage, something that might be stronger, more authentic, and more deeply rooted than what stood before.